Hello, my name is Willow Hozella, and I'm going to be discussing the role of appropriate instruction in reducing problem behavior, specifically for students with autism. I want to start out by stating that it's important to remember that any time that you're addressing problematic behavior, that it's a team effort. Nobody's going to be able to go it alone, as they say. And oftentimes, the answers or the solutions necessary to address problematic behavior are not simple. If there were simple answers, I think people would more readily address the problem with success. And it's tough. And each student is unique. They come to us with their own history of learning, and that includes learning to engage in problem behavior, perhaps to access things or to avoid demands and things of that nature. And because each individual student comes with their individual history, it's oftentimes going to be necessary to individualize our interventions. I don't know of any panacea that solves all problem behavior. I suspect if such a thing were to exist, somebody would publish a book and they would retire comfortably. But there are, fortunately, some very systematic approaches using an empiric approach to our instruction that can be very helpful in reducing problem behavior. And today what I'll be focusing on is the role of instruction, which is significant in reducing problematic behavior. I do want to be clear, I do not have all the answers. I don't pretend to know everything. I can't simply wave a magic wand and solve problem behavior any more than anyone can. But the basic principles derived from applied behavior analysis will guide you and help you become very successful as you learn to employ those principles, whether that's for reducing problematic behavior or increasing preferred behavior, increasing socially acceptable behavior. Those are all things within the purview of behavior analysis, and that is the approach that I'm going to discuss a bit today. It's also important that you know not to blame the students. Students aren't engaging in problematic behavior because they want to get your goat or make you angry or things like that. Students learn to engage in problem behavior. They're inadvertently taught to engage in problem behavior. We all do what works for us. We all do whatever will improve our circumstances, even momentarily. And when we say we do what works, what we're talking about is an environment behavior relationship, where we're going to look at the environment and the context in which the behavior occurs, and we're going to affect change in the behavior by changing the environment. And part of the environment in school settings, oftentimes in home settings, instruction is a big part of that environment for students. I also want to take a moment just to state it's important that when working with students who engage in problematic behavior, whether you're a teacher, a para, TSS, a parent, or any related service provider, SLPs, anybody, it's important that you recognize that it's not your fault in the sense of you're doing something to evoke the problematic behavior on purpose, as they say. There are so many factors that can affect behavior, and the tools at our disposal are teaching tools, or tools to teach new behavior, and tools that prevent problematic behavior from being successful, which means contact reinforcement. When we look at problematic behavior, we were looking at an environment behavior relationship. And this is a very optimistic viewpoint because everybody working with a student is part of that environment. They're people who can change their behaviors in order to be more effectual in changing the student's behaviors. So while we don't want to take problem behavior personal, we also don't want to beat ourselves up about it too much, especially if you haven't received any training on what to do or how to do it. Just as a person couldn't jump in a pool and learn to swim suddenly and magically, you need to learn to teach. You need to be trained to address problem behavior in a systematic way. And Once again, the training and the teaching are going to be derived from the principles of behavior analysis. I'm using the term behavior here. I do want to be clear. Behavior is just what the student does, whether it's reading a book, talking on the phone, sitting down, standing up. Behavior is the movement of someone through their environment. When I say behavior, I'm not referring to problem behavior, but really any behavior, any movement. And also remember that behavior includes speaking, saying things, whether that be vocally, with sign, with other modalities. Speaking is behaving as well, and that's critical. So when you hear behavior, don't think problem behavior, think movement through the environment. Now, to talk about instruction, we want to talk about learning. Learning is not a passive event. People don't often sit and simply absorb things like a sponge. Learning is only evidenced by what a person does following the teaching. If I said to you, I know how to ride a bike, you might believe me. You know, he's an older guy and he's probably learned to ride a bike at some point. But if you drove down my street and saw me trying to get on the bike and falling over and failing to get off the curb without falling over, you would say that he perhaps hasn't learned to ride his bike so well. He needs some more practice. It's no different with our students. If we say a student has learned something as a result of their time in our classroom or in whatever instructional setting you're in, if we say they've learned something, the only evidence that we should look for then is the difference in performance of what the student does following the teaching. That's evidence of learning, that somebody does something different as a result of something that somebody else taught them. With this in mind, consider that learning and teaching just means that the student is going to respond in the correct way under the correct conditions. That when you want something, you'll ask appropriately. When you're asked to do something, you'll do it. Those types of things. That's learning. Learning is behaving, and it's critical to know that we can't take presumptions. We can't say, oh, he surely learned that because he's so and so, because he's say so many years old or something along those lines. Learning is only evidenced by the behavior of the person who has been taught. When we talk about instruction, I'd like to give a broad overview for the considerations for instruction that I'm going to review in a little more detail through this presentation. The first is to be clear about what you are teaching. Be clear about what you're teaching simply means use explicit instructions. This isn't just beneficial for students with autism. Students in gen ed settings, students with and without intellectual disabilities will benefit from clear, explicit instructions. Use plain language, don't add a lot of stuff. Simply state what you want the person to do, and then if you're teaching them, you may have to model it, you may have to prompt, there are all sorts of things to consider, but you want to be very clear, you want to be explicit in your instruction. You also need to use a skills sequence, which is the second point you see on the screen here, teach first things first. A skills sequence is simply a series of skills that build to some other terminal performance. As a small example, if you were looking at a skills sequence for something like riding a bike, you would need to first be able to get on the bike. You might need to be able to move your legs in a pedal motion, steering the handlebars. All of these things are skills that you learn as you learn to ride a bike that results in that final performance. But if a person got onto a bike and was unable to pump their legs up and down, we may have to teach that first before ever moving on to something like steering or some other skill. So you want to have a clear skills sequence for what a person is to do. The third broad point that I'd like to make before getting into the particulars is that it's important not to expect that all students advance at the same rate. It's almost impossible for a class of 8 or 10 or 28 students, that they're all going to acquire skills at the same rate. This is, once again, not unique to classrooms serving students with autism. This is all classrooms. Students arrive with different learning histories, with different precursor skills that may or may not have been mastered. And as a result, some students will move quicker than others, pardon me, in their acquisition of new skills being taught. Finally, program your subject matter. When we talk about programming your subject matter, what we mean are use systematic procedures, errorless teaching for teaching new skills, error correction procedures for when a student makes an error. Have a clear criteria for when a skill is mastered. That's something that is extremely important, that all of these things are in place so that anybody working with the student knows how to teach these new skills, what to do if an error should occur, and how to determine that a student has mastered that skill. And you no longer need to teach it, but now you can move on to something perhaps a bit more complex. That's what program the subject matter is referring to, this idea that there is a systematic sequencing with staff, with instructors, whoever it may be, who are going to use these skills, use these procedures to teach students new skills, and by teaching them new skills, move up that skills sequence so that you can get to more complex repertoires of behavior. As I mentioned earlier, this is not unique to special education or any particular audience or set of people or population. This is just good teaching. This is the procedures, these are the approaches we should be taking in all of our instructional environments. All students benefit from clear instruction. All students benefit from instruction being something that improves conditions for them, that things get better as a result of learning, as a result of interacting with an instructor in a learning environment. That's true for everybody, including myself and everyone listening to this presentation right now. While getting toward instruction, I also wanted to make a small bit here. This session will not discuss how to assess the function of problem behavior. Anytime we are addressing problematic behavior, we should have some assessment that clearly identifies the function of that problem behavior. These are often done through FBAs or FAs. It's important that an assessment has been completed and that people aren't designing interventions based on what they think the function of the problem behavior, their opinion of what is occurring. You want clear data because that's going to prevent you from doing the wrong intervention, which will simply prolong the period of time that the student is engaging in problematic behavior. So while I won't be going over how to assess and how to identify functions of problem behavior, I would encourage you to go through the NAC archives. They'll also be on, I believe it's slide 75, I think. There's a resource link on this presentation that has a large amount of resources available that review how to assess function, common functions of behavior, interventions related to those functions, so on and so forth. The National Autism Conference Archives also features a number of sessions on functional FBAs and FAs and things of that nature, and determining what is causing the problem behavior, what type of reinforcement is maintaining this problematic behavior that we need to get rid of by reducing motivation to engage in the problem behavior, by teaching replacement behavior, and by making sure that when the problem behavior does occur, it doesn't contact improving conditions, that reinforcement doesn't occur for difficult or problematic behavior. These are the common functions of behavior, including problem behavior. For this session, I will be focusing on the three highlighted here. I do want to be clear that instruction absolutely has a role in addressing automatic problem behavior that is maintained by automatic reinforcement. But the majority of what I'll be talking about involves instruction and setting up instructional arrangements to reduce students' motivation to engage in escaping those situations and making those situations improving for the students so that they can look at learning as something positive and something to be approached. You know, you want kids sort of running to the desk to work with you. So while I won't be discussing explicitly this automatic reinforcement, do know that instruction still has a significant role in addressing behavior that's maintained. And I'll speak plainly here. Automatic reinforcement means that whatever the student is doing, it simply feels good. And that's what's maintaining the behavior. What I'll be focusing on are the highlighted ones where we have socially mediated positive reinforcement. And that may be for things like tangibles, you know, edible reinforcement, candy, stuff like that, toys, access to an activity or a preferred item, as well as socially mediated negative reinforcement, which is related to removal of something, where the student engages in a problematic behavior and perhaps a demand is removed, or perhaps the person backs away and no longer maintains the demand. Socially mediated positive reinforcement can also include attention-maintained behavior. I would caution you, if attention is the function, you also want to see if there are aspects of socially mediated positive reinforcement related to tangibles. Sometimes attention can be a bid or an opportunity by the student to make a request. Even if the request is in the form of problem behavior, they may be asking for what they want, and what they need to be taught is to ask for what they want. We'll talk about that as we move forward. So before we get started into the instructional piece, I wanted to briefly mention the idea of an ABC analysis of behavior. An ABC analysis of behavior involves observing the antecedent condition, which just means what happened immediately before the behavior. The behavior of the student or the person, which is simply what the person does. It's observable and it's measurable. And then the consequence, what happens after the behavior. I want to be clear, when I use the term consequence, sometimes that's associated with something like punishment or some sort of consequence that's perhaps not enjoyable or good for the student. Consequence here is simply referring to what happens immediately after the behavior. It doesn't have any of those implications for the purpose of this presentation. By observing what happens immediately before and immediately after the behavior, we can allow for some prediction. I'll give you a small example, and there'll be some more examples on the next slide. If I tell I have two daughters, and if I tell my 6-year-old daughter, Isabel, get off your iPad and come here to dinner, it's time to eat. The antecedent to whatever she's about to do is that I asked her to turn off her iPad, come to dinner. If I ask her to come to dinner, turn off your iPad, come to dinner, Isabel, and she begins having some problematic behavior. She starts crying, whining, saying how she hasn't finished her show and so forth. And then as a consequence, I say, okay, 5 more minutes. You can finish your show, that's fine. Looking at that from an ABC analysis, we have, you're told to do something, you engage in some problematic behavior, and the demand to do that thing is removed or postponed for a little bit until you're done your show in this example. If in the future I ask Isabel to come to dinner and she engages in problematic behavior, we can say that there is probably a reasonable inference to be made that she is engaging in that problematic behavior because her father keeps letting her watch her show and removes the demand to come to dinner. She is escaping a demand. If you recall the former slide, that's socially mediated negative reinforcement. I remove something, things get better for her, she gets to watch her show, and As a result, it happens more in the future under those same circumstances. These are some other ABC examples. I'm going to do my best not to read the slides to all of you wonderful folks. These examples are there to highlight that the ABC analysis can be used for fairly simple behaviors, such as looking in the direction. Something startling, a startling noise happens and everybody turns and looks toward the noise. And as a result of turning and looking, they see that a box has fallen that was full of glass or something like that. And they see that event. So the antecedent was something happened, the behavior was looking, the consequence was seeing the event. A fairly simple example of an ABC analysis. Just know that even more complex behaviors are amenable to this ABC analysis. You see the second example here, a teacher asking a question regarding a Supreme Court decision, Brown v. Board of Ed, and the student responds, and the student, as a result of that response contacts good stuff in the form of teacher approval, if that's valuable to the student, and if the consequence occurred close to the time that the student gave their response, they may be more likely to answer questions from the teacher in the future. And if so, then we would say that that was socially mediated positive reinforcement. What you should know is that this ABC analysis is not limited simply to, I tell a student, clap your hands, the student claps their hands, and they get an M&M. The ABC analysis can be used to look at and to observe and to analyze very simple to unbelievably complex behavior. In talking about consequences, I want to make two very quick and clear points. Positive reinforcement is a good thing where as the result or as immediately following the behavior, something is added to the environment, and as a result, the frequency of that behavior, the likelihood, of that behavior increases in the future. Negative reinforcement is also an improving condition. It is a good thing. You want negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is where something is removed and things get better, and as a result, the person does whatever they did that immediately followed the removal, or preceded, the removal of whatever the aversive situation was. To put it in plain English, think of staying at a hotel, and you go to get into the shower, and you immediately get scalded. You put your arm in, and the water hits your arm, and it's too hot. What do? You pull your arm out of the shower. Removing your arm removes the aversive, or painful in this case, stimulus, the hot water hitting your arm. As a result, you've learned over time that if you touch something hot and painful, you remove your hand. You don't keep touching it. That's the result of negative reinforcement. You do that because things get better for you immediately. Now, throughout this presentation, I'm going to be advocating heavily for the use of positive reinforcement because it teaches students that other people are of value, that good stuff comes from people, that there's somebody to approach and communicate with and interact with. Negative reinforcement, as you may infer by my example, requires that things are not so great and you do something to make them better. Well, I don't want to make students' lives not so great if I can avoid it. So I'm going to focus on positive reinforcement as a tool to use. However, negative reinforcement does occur in schools. It often occurs inadvertently. A student walks into my classroom and I say, hey buddy, put your coat and your hat and your cubby and come sit down. We're going to do your math work. And the student runs up and kicks me in the shin and runs out of the room. And I chase him down and I get him back in, but I don't tell him to take his hat and coat off because I don't like getting kicked, and they don't pay me enough for this kind of thing, and whatever it may be. As a result, the student may learn that they can postpone or prevent instruction from occurring by engaging in problematic behavior, by removing the demand I have provided negative reinforcement for the problematic behavior. Once again, this is inadvertent. People don't do these things on purpose, but it's an important difference to attend to. Positive reinforcement increases behavior. Negative reinforcement also increases behavior. Pardon me. Positive reinforcement increases behavior by adding something to the environment. Negative reinforcement increases behavior by removing something from the environment. Finally, there's a final consequence I'll briefly mention, which is punishment. Punishment is simply any consequence that decreases the future likelihood of behavior. Punishment is neither good nor bad. It's an effect on behavior. Just as reinforcement is neither good nor bad, it's an effect on behavior. There are things that reinforce behavior that are problematic. Cigarette smoking is a behavior reinforced by consumption of nicotine. And even though that's reinforcement, we all know the health impacts. Punishment, very similarly, can be a good thing in certain circumstances. Sometimes I'll go out, sometimes I used to go out with my wife to meet up with some friends at a diner here. And I like to talk about B.F. Skinner's 1957 book, Verbal Behavior. It's of keen interest to me. I love to talk about it. None of my wife's friends do. They don't much care for that book or hearing me talk about it. I don't think any of them have read it. They probably have heard enough of it from me. If I start talking about that book, people at the diner start getting up and going to the bathroom. They start looking at their phones. They start engaging in conversation with someone else. That has punished my behavior of talking about that topic with that crowd of folks. That's a good thing for me. I'm a better social animal as a result. I can interact with my wife's friends a little more readily. They're happier to have me at their house and that kind of thing. So punishment is simply an effect on behavior, even though it often involves a worsening condition as a consequence. For instance, the removal of attention from friends, from my example. It can also teach you how to behave under certain circumstances. I will say that there are many ethical considerations that need to be taken account of before using contrived punishment in an instructional setting. Not just because the law states that explicitly, but also because if you use these types of contrived punishment, you take away recess, any detention, you can use your imagination. You know what sort of punishments are often attempted to be used in schools. You become part of the circumstance where the punishment occurs. So if you're using a lot of punishment, you may become a warning signal. I don't want to interact with that guy. Bad stuff happens when I do. So I'll engage in behavior to avoid interacting with that guy. Moving from the consequence to the antecedent, I'm going to talk about motivation. Motivation is an antecedent that establishes the value of some kind of reinforcement. I'll give you a small example. If I were to tell you, I will give you $200 if you can write the last 7 letters of the alphabet. If you did not have a pen and paper or a pencil and paper or a crayon or a chalkboard and chalk, something to write those 7 letters would become valuable because of the promised $200. Notice that there was no intrinsic value to paper and pen. You weren't thinking or pondering or considering how you were going to get paper and pen at that moment until the offer of a $200 payday to write 7 letters came. Motivation is in the environment. Once again, this is a very optimistic viewpoint because we are part of the environment, and that means that we can affect motivation, the motivation of our students. And that includes motivation to engage in instruction, motivation to learn, things of that nature. So motivation is an antecedent that makes something valuable as the result of changes in the environment. When students are engaging in problematic behavior to escape instruction, when they're engaging in problematic behavior to avoid or postpone instruction, then we should be looking at what we can do in the antecedent to reduce motivation to engage in that problematic behavior to escape instruction. Sometimes instruction can become a warning signal that things are about to get worse. This can happen because instruction is too difficult or too easy. And we'll talk about this a little further when I get to the assessment section, but just know that just as doing something that is extraordinarily easy for a long period of time may become boring, doing something that's too difficult and trying to figure out what you're supposed to do, especially if you have deficits in communication, is going to be very frustrating and may establish the value of getting the heck out of there, of avoiding the instruction, of not engaging with the person that's trying to teach. Instruction must be at the appropriate level in order to avoid setting up circumstances where instruction becomes something to be ducked or avoided or postponed. Another thing that can make instruction a warning signal is not enough reinforcement. Good stuff isn't happening, in particular positive reinforcement. Reinforcement should be embedded into instruction. It should be a part of any instructional session, should always involve reinforcement, good stuff happening, contingent on the student's performance and the student doing well, and differential reinforcement, better reinforcement. When the student does better, they get more or better quality of whatever it is they like. Instruction that always begins with the removal of preferred items or activities. Now, I'm not advocating for having a student, play their iPad while they engage in instruction. But if all instruction involves first giving up what you have or what you're doing, it may become very difficult to get students to give up that reinforcement. We'll talk a little bit about that at the very end when we talk about some behavior procedures. And finally, and this is a point that I'll expand on for a moment here, a slow pace of instruction can make instruction something to be avoided. How do we then make instruction an improving set of conditions? The first thing we're going to do, as I mentioned, is to embed reinforcement that's coming from the instructor into the instructional session. When I say that the reinforcement is coming from the instructor, what I mean is they are providing it. They're providing, here's a bit of candy, here's a head squeeze, here's a funny joke, here, let's read together. Depending on what's valuable for the student, the instructor is providing that as they're doing well. Another way to make instruction a set of improving conditions is to use errorless teaching. Errorless teaching is simply teaching that prevents the student from making a mistake by using something they can already do. So if I was going to teach a student the capital of Pennsylvania, the first thing I would have to do is make sure that they had some way to say Harrisburg. But if I ask what's the capital of Pennsylvania, the student can't respond. I then need to teach it. And the way to teach it is to, rather than let the student guess or make an error, to simply prompt and then move from prompted to unprompted. And then at some point in the future, come back and check to make sure that the skill was maintained for a bit of time. You want to pair your instruction with positive reinforcement. You want lots of good stuff happening as a result of the student's interaction with you in these instructional settings. You need to fade in demands. And when I say fade in demands, I mean both the number of demands and the overall effort. So when I'm working with students in classrooms, the first thing I may be doing is providing a bit of free reinforcement. Here, have some candy, buddy. Come here, let's bounce on the trampoline, whatever sort of the student enjoys. And then I'll fade in some easy demands. If it's a student who we've been playing around and I've gotten a couple of approach type of responses, I might say, give me high five, and see if the student will give me a 5. That's a demand. It's very easy, and it's couched into this sort of, I shouldn't say it's very easy. It's very easy for many students, not all, and it's couched within this instructional sort of context but that's a first sort of demand that we can fade in, and then we work toward the more complex stuff, toward the more difficult stuff. This idea of fading in demands is critical because school is often sort of conceptualized as a place where you're always learning new stuff, which is true. You should be learning new stuff in school. I don't dispute that. However, making sure you're learning is going to involve you being a cooperative learner, and fading in demands can make sure that cooperative learning occurs because the student will be more likely to respond to you if at first things aren't too difficult. Fast-paced instruction is the last point that I'm going to go over for right now on making instruction a set of improving conditions, because I want to talk about a small case study, a bit of research that was conducted in some classrooms around here in Pennsylvania. For this case study, what we did was to set up instructional sessions where we taught at different rates. What you're looking at here, this graph you're looking at here, is a young man who would engage in problematic behavior to escape instruction. There was an FBA conducted to confirm that this was the function. And what you're looking at are the 3 different rates of instruction. You see 1 second at the bottom. That's the fastest rate of instruction. That's where the instructor is really moving at a good clip. What 1 second interval means is that if I were when I was the instructor, I might ask the student something like, touch your nose. The student touched their nose, 1 second went by, and I asked them to do something else. Clap your hands. And the student clapped their hands. 1 second goes by, I asked them to do something else. All the while maintaining a reinforcement schedule, the same reinforcement schedule across each of these. So what you see here is the frequency of problem behavior across each of these pace of instruction sessions. And what you see is that the slowest pace of instruction, that 10-second interval at the very top, that's the one that evokes the most problem behavior. And that was true for all of the participants in this study. For one of the participants, the only time she never had problematic behavior was during the fastest rate of instruction. So fast-paced instruction, meaning sort of a brisk pace, is a good practice and will reduce motivation to escape. And that can seem a little counterintuitive because people are thinking, well, but you're going quicker and there's more demands. There are more demands in the faster session because all the sessions are the same period. But if I'm going faster, I'm going to ask the kid to do more stuff. So why? Why would it be that more demands at a faster pace would have less problematic behavior? I think it's because of this effect. What you see here is the frequency of reinforcement per session. And what you see here, what's on the graph in front of you is almost an inverse of the previous graph, where the slowest instruction is at the bottom, because the slowest instruction contacted the least amount of reinforcement. Whereas in the the fast-paced instruction up at the top, that contacted the most reinforcement for the student's responses. So when you're going faster, you can provide more reinforcement because there's more opportunities to reinforce the student's behavior. Fast pace of instruction is not something that is commonly thought of as beneficial for people with intellectual disabilities. You'll often hear people say, well, we need to go a bit slower, we need to take our time, give them time to think, let them process that. The students I am fortunate enough to work with don't have time to go slower. They have these communicative deficits, and I want them to be independent, happy members of society. And that means that we need to work to get as many skills taught as efficiently and effectively as possible. Slow-paced instruction does not do that. And from what this research was a replication of previous research. What it seems to indicate is that not only does it offer less opportunity to teach, it offers the student more opportunity to engage in problematic behavior, which was reflected as you saw in the previous graph. These results, by the way, were replicated across all of the participants in this study. If you are interested in any of that research, my email address is on the last slide. Feel free to email me. I'll be happy to share any of the data with you. I also did a session last year at the National Autism Conference on that research, which is provided here at this link. So we're going to return now back to reducing motivation to engage in escape behavior. And how do we make, what I'm saying, to say it in plain spoken terms, is how do you make instruction something the student is going to look forward to and want to do? These 5 points are 5 additional considerations that should be embedded into instruction. Interspersing easy and hard tasks is critical, pardon me, for students with autism because it provides opportunity for review of previously mastered skills. If I were to ask any of you, unfortunately we're not able to be live due to the coronavirus, and I'm used to doing these things in a live setting, and something that I might do would be to say something along the lines of, who's the 40th president? And some people may remember it, some people sort of guess, Bush? Was it Bush Sr.? The reason that most people forget who presidents were, state capital, things like that, is lack of practice. I would struggle to do, I can tell you after this school year of working with my middle school age daughter, I do struggle to do algebra. I don't remember it. Why don't I remember it? Because I don't have any practice. Interspersing easy and hard tasks is an opportunity to practice previously mastered skills while also teaching new skills. So this idea of we're not always working on the hardest thing, we're also practicing other stuff we've learned, is critical because it will also allow opportunity for the student to have some easy responses. The instructor can provide reinforcement for those responses while embedding errorlessly taught more difficult tasks into the teaching. Another thing to do is to mix and vary your instructional demands. The reason you mix and vary your instructional demands is because it keeps teaching unpredictable and it keeps it fresh. You want to consider things that are novel to the student, task novelty. That doesn't just have to be a novel task, but try, if you're doing discrete trial instruction, for instance, if you're working with picture cards and 3x5 cards, you might consider doing that in different areas or using other objects. You know, you've taught a student to label a pen, a picture of a pen. Now you're in the art room. Can the student label the calligraphy pen as a pen? That not only provides a bit of novelty, it also provides you with an opportunity to see how well the student is generalizing those skills. Ideally, you want to keep your session durations brief. This will obviously be somewhat student specific. However, we make a general recommendation about 20 minutes. 20 minutes of instruction, and then you can move into 20 minutes of some other instruction, but you're not going to stay doing the same thing. Ideally, you do want to keep session durations brief. And the final point there is to immediately deliver reinforcement when students are responding well. If I ask a student to show me ready hands and he immediately goes into ready hands, I want to have something good there so that the moment he does this, good stuff happens. It'll make it more likely that in the future when I ask that student, hey, can you show me ready hands? That he'll do this, because that immediacy of reinforcement. Pardon me. So let's talk about reducing motivation to engage in problem behavior. In this case, what we're talking about is students who engage in problem behavior to escape a demand. They're not going to follow a direction. They're going to avoid instruction, whatever it may be. When I say escape, the technical term I'm referring to is socially mediated negative reinforcement. And what you see here are 5 points to consider for reducing that motivation. The first is the student engaging in problem behavior because they want to escape or delay instruction? Or is it related to something else? Does this have to do with some other thing that's occurring. The next thing to consider is instruction a warning signal? Just consider this example. You're driving down the highway and you look up to your left, and there on the left is one of Pennsylvania's state trooper. Well, I guess this is international. So there's a cop on the berm and they have their radar gun out and they're pulling people over for speeding. You take your foot off the gas, you may even press the brake. Why do you do that? We're taught that police are there to protect us and that kind of thing. Why do you avoid interacting with a cop under those circumstances? Because it's always been paired with a worsening condition. Points on your license, heavy fines, being late to work, whatever it may be. If your instruction is similar to the cop, if it's a warning signal, things are going to get worse if I do any of this stuff, then the student may do the equivalent of pumping the brakes a bit, and that may include problematic behavior. Use of promise reinforcement. This is very much related to things like, if you do X, then you'll get Y. For many of our students, it's better to be very clear about promise reinforcement. You might show the student, I have a little bag of gummies here, you might show them some of their preferred candy and say, let's go to the library if they have difficulty transitioning to the library. And the moment they get into the library, boom, good stuff happens. Is instruction at the right level according to assessment? This is going to take up a good chunk of the presentation. This is the idea that, have we identified the right skill sequence, and are we teaching in the right order? Are we teaching first things first as we're programming for students to learn new skills? And finally, are teaching procedures appropriate? Are we using errorless teaching where it's appropriate? Are we letting students problem solve where it's appropriate for, say, more advanced learners? And whatever we're doing, whatever teaching methodology that we're using, are we actually doing it? The only way to know that is to have somebody observe your teaching and take data on the fidelity of it. It's important that we're observed as we work so that we can get feedback, because it's impossible, short of recording yourself and then watching it later, to observe yourself. You're always looking out. There's like I said, short of a video camera, it's very difficult to get a different viewpoint as far as your interactions with students. So we're going to talk now about instruction at the right level so that we avoid making instruction a warning signal that things are about to get worse. Within instruction, a critical aspect of it is that it involves active student responding. You need students to be doing stuff constantly. You want them saying stuff, writing if they can write, if they're ready to write, if that's appropriate according to assessment. There are all sorts of high-tech and low-tech gadgets that allow students to respond in different ways. I'm sure that some of you fine folks have been in sessions where they use a doodle or they use one of those other apps on your phone. Whatever it might be, you want dense amounts of active student responding. The reason for this is twofold. The first is that downtime is deadly. If you give a student 20 minutes to sit on an iPad, 20 minutes at the computer, 20 minutes to play with the puzzle, whatever it might be, that downtime may lead to them finding some other stuff to fill the time and doing something else that maybe isn't as preferred. Active student responding is also important because you don't know if a student is listening to you. One of the biggest problems I've had since the quarantine has been in place is that when I do things like this, when I'm interacting with an audience, I'm not interacting with them. I have no audience control. I don't know what anybody's doing. If I was in a live session, I might see the people are looking at their phones or getting up and leaving, and I might change my teaching behavior as a result. But I can't do that with this type of format right now because I have to pre-record and so on. The point being is that active student responding actually gives you some evidence that what you're teaching is changing behavior, because you can ask students to respond, say, on cue. You can ask students to respond by holding up, 1 for true, 2 for false, or whatever it might be. you can embed this type of active responding to prevent downtime. I have idle hands there. My grandmother always used to tell me that idle hands were the devil's workshop, Willow. You can't be, what she was saying is, you're going to be doing a lot of stuff while I watch you because I don't want you figuring out what you want to do because it might not jive with what I want you to do. And finally, the reason active student responding is so important is because it allows us more opportunities to reinforce the students responding. Because we reinforce behavior, we don't reinforce students, we provide reinforcement for behavior. That means we need some behavior to occur so that we can reinforce it, so that it'll increase across time. Active student responding is a critical aspect of instruction and should be, it should merit a significant amount of attendance for, or people attending to that issue, whether they're educators or people observing educators, whoever you may be. Remember, you want to keep students moving by having them respond in a way you can measure and observe. And this brings me now to sort of the meat of the presentation. I'm now going to talk about the role of instruction as it relates to 3 learner profiles. I'm using the term early learner, intermediate learner, and advanced learner for the purpose of this presentation. I do want to be clear, these are broad general descriptions and are not meant to be descriptive of a particular student. There are many students who are doing some early learner programs, but are beginning now to go into intermediate programs, perhaps. This isn't, you know, these kids are early learners and these kids are advanced. That's not what I'm saying here. I'm describing in broad strokes some general profiles of performance across 3 sort of domains that are arbitrarily selected. So when I say early learner, that's not a value judgment any more than advanced or intermediate is. And regardless, students' instruction in schools should be individualized. It shouldn't be based necessarily on general descriptions, but I want people to have attended this session to understand some of the complexities and some of the issues that do occur across different segments of the population. As I said earlier, different people have different learning histories, and as instructors, as teachers, it's our job to meet them where they're at and then teach from there. So these profiles also, I wanted to make a brief comment, they are not related to the age of the student. The age of the student isn't something I'm going to talk too much about in this session. I'm talking about performance of the student, what the student can do, what they can't do yet because they haven't learned how to do it and been taught how to do those things. That's what I'm referring to when I refer to early, intermediate, and advanced. Regardless of the learner that arrives in your classroom, excuse me, learners, the first thing you want to do is consider an assessment and then conduct that assessment. For students with autism, a language and communication assessment is critical. This assessment of the student's language should include some sort of check for generalization. Just because the student does it with Mr. Willow in Mr. Willow's class every day doesn't mean that he then goes home and it does the same thing, or that he does that in the cafeteria or the art room or with their peer buddy or anything else. You want to check for generalization across people, across places, across material. All of these things are considerations you need to make. So when you're doing your assessment, you want to see, does this performance translate into other environments or with other instructors, so on and so forth. Your assessment should check for novel responding, meaning the student has never been taught necessarily how to respond to something, but they're able to respond accurately anyway. Just think of this sort of like, how do you know that a person can engage in an algorithm, in algorithmic problem solving for math problem? Well, you would probably present them with a math problem that they had no experience with, and they would use the problem solving skills, the algorithm, in order to solve that novel problem. Even though there's no history with that specific math problem, you're looking at a novel response where they sort of recombined what they'd learned and used it to come up with a correct answer. Your assessment should absolutely include a description of under what conditions a response occurs. That's a critical point that can be missed. If I say to a student, "What is it?" and they say pen, but later when I have the pen in a field on a table in front of the student and I say, "Where's the pen?" they just look at me and say pen and they don't select it, then I have some teaching to do before I can ever justifiably say that the student understands what a pen is. So when we're talking about assessment, we want to talk about under what circumstances does a response occur. Finally, any assessment of students' language should involve an operant analysis. That's just that ABC analysis of verbal and nonverbal behavior. That ABC analysis will give us a lot of the information I've already discussed here because we're looking at the antecedent. We've defined the behavior and we're discussing the consequence. And that is an important piece to any assessment that is conducted. This assessment of student language should provide some starting point for instruction. Whereabouts is the student's language ability so that we can start there and work toward complexity. A good assessment will also give you a potential task analysis. It will identify precursor skills necessary so that you don't jump up the mountain too quickly, as people will say. It will identify those precursor skills so that you can teach them, and you can teach them to fluency and accuracy. The task analysis is going to allow you to move from what people sometimes refer to as simple programs into more complex programs, including complex verbal behavior. Your assessment should include some measure of both accuracy and fluency. Now, when I say fluency, what I mean is that the student does it quickly. They do it quickly and effectively. When I say accuracy, I mean they're correct. So I have in front of me a notebook. If I ask a student, "What is this?" and I show them my notebook, and they say, that's a notebook. They were accurate, but they were not fluent. And you need to work on fluency. Fluency is a skill, and it can be taught, and it should be taught. It's critical. Because in the real world, when you transition from school and you're working at a hotel, whether you're working at a restaurant or you're working anywhere, fluent responding is necessary. If it takes you an hour to clean up a hotel room and get the linens out and push the cart down the hall, you might not be able to maintain your employment. The idea of fluency is often thought of and discussed in education related to reading and math, but fluency is a behavioral phenomenon. It's doing something accurately and quickly, and that needs to be a consideration in your assessment and in your instruction and your mastery criteria. Finally, your assessment as you conduct it should also include some evaluation of what the student has not yet learned to do. And this is basically recording what the student gets incorrect, what the student struggles with, what the student doesn't do well with, or what they make errors on, what they don't respond to at all. Any of those things, those demands or those instructions will need to be taught in the future. So record not just what the student does accurately, also record what errors have occurred, so you can consider those as perhaps initial targets, depending on how complex the skill is and the assessment and the learners that you've been working with. So let's talk a little bit about the early learner profile. I'm going to be talking about early learners here, and the first sort of common trend as far as performance goes is that early learners often struggle to ask for what they want in an appropriate way. They may ask for what they want in the form of problem behavior. They may ask for what they want by wandering over and standing next to it, or maybe pointing at it or tapping on it. They might just try and grab it. And those skills, this asking in the form of problem behavior, requesting by standing near, we need to work against that in teaching the student how to ask for something. So that when you're thirsty and you want a glass of water and there's a glass of water on the table, the student learns to say water, or they learn to sign and ask for water in some other way if they're not able to speak. What I'm describing here is most often referred to as manned training in behavior analysis. There are a wealth of resources on that resource link, as well as on the National Autism Conference archives about manned training. Manned training is a fascinating and unbelievably fulfilling and wonderful thing to do. It's what I miss most about not being able to be back in schools, is running manned sessions with students, because they're always so fun. You got the kiddo responding and they learn to ask for what they want. And asking for what you want is like the first step towards self-advocacy. You see the last point here, little or no approach to others. Why might that be? Why do early learners not approach other people? I would put forth that it's because they haven't learned the value of other people, because they can't make requests, because they haven't learned how to do that yet. Once you learn to make requests, you can then learn to respond to other people's requests. And that is the first step towards social skills, social interaction, reciprocal relationships, things of that nature. Not approaching others may be an indication that the student needs to learn that other people can mediate, can provide reinforcement. That good stuff happens when I approach other people. And good stuff especially happens when I specify what I want, when I mand or when I request. I am going to try to avoid technical language as much as I can for this presentation. So if you see a technical term, I'll try and define it in common terms. In this case, mand simply means to ask for or to request something that you want. And we're going to talk about this across all three learner profiles, because there are very complex mands that may need to be taught to even very advanced learners. The early learner profile also often involves students who have difficulty labeling common objects. Just to stick with the example of the pen, I might ask them what it is, and they might say nothing at all. They might give an incorrect response, such as blue, or write with it. Well, that's the color, and that's what you do with it, but I asked, what is it? This labeling repertoire, saying what something is, you'll hear at many of the sessions at the conference referred to as a tact. Think of it as coming in contact with your environment. All this is for the purpose of anybody who's not a behavior analyst, for anybody who's just looking to learn about programming. If I say tact, you can think of it as the same thing as a label, as labeling a common object, labeling common actions, things of that nature. It's a critical skill what something is when they see it, hear it, smell it, taste it, feel it, whatever it may be. Students who are early learners often have very little imitation. They don't imitate others readily. Imitation is a critical skill. If you've ever been in a country where you don't speak the language and you go into a restaurant, maybe it's a buffet or something, you go into the restaurant and you don't know what to do. You don't know the rules of the restaurant, but you also don't speak the native language. So you can't just ask the maitre d'. So what do? You watch people. You watch them for a minute and you figure out, oh, do I get a fresh tray? Do I do this? Do I start here? Imitation is an extremely important repertoire, and it will actually be a large chunk of the early learner teaching and programming that I'll be going over here in a moment. Early learners will sometimes have limited or completely absent echoic repertoires. Loosely speaking, they can't say what was said to them. These learners will often have they haven't yet learned how to answer questions. They might know some fun fill-ins where you say, you know, who lives in a pineapple under the sea? And the kid says, SpongeBob. And that's a sort of call and response, maybe a little rote from being an avid cartoon watcher, but they won't answer accurately questions like, what's your name? Where do you live? What town do you live in? Things of that nature. And that those fun fill-ins may provide some opportunity for you to have some easy responses, but you want to make sure not to program for answering those types of WH questions until the student has a very good repertoire of other skills. We'll talk about that at the advanced and intermediate level. Early learners often have limited social interaction. Once again, this is directly related to man training, to teaching them to request, because once you can request from adults, you'll need to be taught to learn to request from peers, and so on and so forth. Students who are early learners will often engage in high rates of stereotypy, repetitive motor actions such as flapping or dangling things in front of their eyes, that kind of thing. Early learners often have high rates of problematic behavior as well. It may be that because of the restricted nature of the verbal repertoires that these students arrive in our classrooms with, it may be that most instruction is simply very, very difficult. And we need to look for the opportunities to provide a lot of chances for the student to do easy things, contact reinforcement, so that we can get some instructional control before moving to more complex programs. On the flip side of high rates of problematic behavior, many times early learners also will have increased levels of passivity. You'll hear people say, he just shuts down. I personally find passivity, students who just won't respond, that's often a little more difficult to address than a student who is perhaps aggressive. Because a student who simply stops moving, looks away from you, and won't even let you physically prompt them, that's more effortful, because there's nothing to shape. There's no behavior in place that you can sort of reinforce different approximations or anything like that. Finally, early learners will often have very limited range of reinforcement. Their preferences and the things that they will engage with or that will increase future opportunities, future likelihood of behavior, is fairly limited. The student might have a very restricted diet and only watch one video that they just watch on repeat or something along those lines. And that's a significant consideration, because that's going to make your job as an instructor more difficult, because you have less tools to work with as far as reinforcers go. However, you can condition new reinforcement. You can teach students that other things are valuable. You can have them try new things. I always tell people, never stop attempting to at least give a kid a chance to interact with some novel toy. Even if they didn't want to play with it yesterday, it may be their favorite today. You know, you don't read the same book over and over again. You vary your reinforcement. Students will prefer that as well. You just as I said, mix and vary your instructional demands. You mix and vary your reinforcement too. If you're always getting Skittles, eventually you're not hungry. So the initial thing to do for an early learner is to check for instructional control and approach behavior. If you turn to the student and say, hey, come here, does the student then walk toward you? If not, it may be of significant benefit to start with free delivery of reinforcement and pairing yourself as an improving condition. Because if you can't get a student to walk toward you when you say, come here, what's the chance they're going to stay sitting with you when you start asking them to do stuff that's a little more complex? Part of your assessment should also include, and this can be something that you do throughout as you're working with the student, identify preferred items, identify preferred activities, identify things the kiddo likes to eat, drink, engage in, play with, read, look at, whatever it may be. Those are all potential reinforcers, and that's your most powerful tool that you have, is reinforcement. So I would encourage you, keep trying new stuff, even if you're thinking, yeesh, this kid only likes Pirate's booty, and that's the only thing he'll eat. He'll never try anything else. Well, maybe give it a try. Offer them some goldfish. If they don't want them, they don't have to take them, that kind of thing. But you do want some sort of assessment of preference so that you know what things may serve as reinforcers. You're going to begin or complete your assessment of skills. You see here assessment across domains. This refers to verbal operants, mands, tacts, echoics, intraverbals, as well as other things like responding as a listener, imitating others, observing people and doing what they do, responding to all sorts of things that are in the environment, whether that be something that somebody asked you to respond to or something that you simply responded to. This kind of assessment is critical. If you're not familiar with the verbal operants, Mike Miklos did an introduction to the National Autism Conference for this year, and that session will review all of the verbal operants and give many good, clear examples. So if that's something of interest and you're not sure, you've never heard these terms before, I'd encourage you to listen to that. It'll be a very good session, I'm sure. Now, for all that I've just described with assessment, especially for early learners, your initial assessment should be brief, it should be efficient. The other thing to consider is if the student arrives into your classroom and you have no instructional control, you may need to focus on gaining instructional control before you ever get to the assessment piece. Because if you ask the student, hey buddy, sit down, and he's already rolling on the floor trying to get away from you, well, how are you going to conduct an assessment that reflects the student's skill set? So if a student comes in with that level of problematic behavior, you're going to want to start working on pairing yourself, provide free reinforcement when no problem behavior is occurring. Simply walk over and don't place any demands. Don't even make eye contact. And if that's evocative, offer something preferred and keep moving. And make it so that once you can get the student to come to you, then you're looking at a student that you can conduct these types of assessments. Do keep in mind that if your initial assessment shows a very early learner, shows a learner with very few skills, but after a week or two of working with you and now you're paired, you start saying, wow, he really has a lot more skills than I thought. You can always refine and reassess without any problems. So your main goal is gain instructional control so you can conduct that assessment, get the assessment done quickly so that you can immediately begin programming for the needs that the student has related to their communicative deficits. As I mentioned, you want to look at what preferred items or activities might serve as reinforcement. What does the child do if you say put them in an area of the room with some toys and you didn't interact with them, you didn't make them do anything? Do they go to one specific toy frequently? Is it always Jake's Neverland pirate themed or something like that? If so, that gives you some ideas for future targets as far as teaching him to request, or future targets for their instruction, but related that you can use these preferred items as reinforcement for better responding. And finally, you do want to consider what is the range of behavior the child emits. If the student walks around and just taps everything, they take their finger and they just walk around just tapping everything, that very limited range of behavior is going to make things difficult for you as an instructor because you don't have as much to work with. Getting an idea of the range of behavior that the child emits will allow you to will help you to develop a clear beginning set of skills from which to sequence from. Early learners programming should include many easy tasks. We often talk about an 80-20, 80 mastered, 20 known for intermediate and advanced learners. 80 mastered, 80% mastered skills that you're reviewing and 20% teaching skills, you're teaching airlessly in a session. For early learners, it may be closer to a 90-10, where they're doing a lot of easy stuff before you sort of sneak in that new skill. Students who are early learners will often benefit from something called an object sort. An object sort is a collection of three-dimensional stimuli, so games, toys, stuffed animals, shoe boxes, shoelaces, anything that is in your classroom, or not, if not in your classroom, at a yard sale, dollar store, whatever it takes, that the student can respond to. Where if I hold out the keyboard to the student, do they tap a key? Do they run their hand back and forth on the keys? Do they turn the volume dial at the top? Any of those responses can become an easy response that we'll use to maintain instructional control. This is a picture, it's actually two pictures sort of placed together of an object sort. The object sort is a way to make sure that there are many easy tasks that the student is accurate and fluent in their performance to allow you to sort of maintain the momentum of an instructional session. Whenever you're setting up a material sort, you're basically looking at what is this student's prior learning history with objects. So you see on the screen to your left, you should see a bunch of put-ins, coffee cans with lids that they've punched holes in, and it looks like pegs. And on the right-hand picture, there's stacking rings and things of that nature. All of these are toys that, or not just toys, but toys and different stimuli the student has some prior history with, or something similar. On the back left picture, you see the pull tubes. What happens if you give the student the tube and it's compressed? Do they pull it? Well, do they do vice versa? If you give a tube opened up, do they compress it? Because those are things that you can then embed into teaching. You can teach the student, pull, show me pulling, or something like that, based on their prior history and their previously mastered skill sets. The criteria within a material sort for moving on to sort of more complex things will almost always be generalized and novel responding. So the student can do it in different ways across different environments, including with objects that they've never interacted with before. That these are completely novel objects that they've never seen before, and that they are still able to respond appropriately when asked to do so by an instructor. As I mentioned, age is not something, there are older learners who are early learners, just as there are very young learners who are advanced learners. That said, when we talk about the age of the student, and especially for early learners, it is significantly important to consider transition goals, ADLs, and what is the social significance of what we're teaching. If a student is older, if they're in high school and secondary, I'm probably going to be using less toys and be focusing more on items that the student's going to encounter in their day-to-day life. It might be putting toothbrushes into a toothbrush holder. It might be matching by sorting silverware or something related that they can then go somewhere and do something with. This idea of transition goals and ADLs is particularly complex for very early learners, because obviously there are a lot of skills that we need to teach, and it's now we need to teach it in a little bit of a hurry. The other reason we use an object sort is because of that pace of instruction. Getting all of this together in one place is very helpful and saves a lot of time, and allows anybody who sits down to work with the student to be able to simply pick up a milk crate and go over and start working with the student, because it has all the kids' stuff in it, as well as information on what the student can and cannot do with those items. This allows for instructors to go quickly to increase their pace of instruction. This is a picture of a wall poster or poster board, or whatever you want to call it, for an object sort with a student with whom I'm lucky enough to work. And what you're looking at up here is the instructor is going to be able to see this. They'll post it up behind the student perhaps, or maybe it's taped to the desk or something along those lines. And you are essentially reaching down into your milk crate, I think is the first one I said, but it could be any container with your object sort, and you're pulling up an object. Notice that as I do that, as I reach down to pull up an object, I don't have to break eye contact with you. I can still keep an eye on the student. The object sort allows you to get whatever your teaching material is, run your trial, and then you take that teaching material and you put it in an empty milk crate over here so that everybody is mixing and varying what they're doing. This poster in front of you is to guide the instructor's behavior. So if I reached into this, into my imaginary material sort, and I pull out the bowl, I can look at this immediately. It's in alphabetical order. Go to B, bowl. Okay, they can give it. They can put any item into it as a listener. So if I say put in, they'll put stuff into the bowl. But they can also put any item in it as imitation. If you show the student what to do, here, do this, they will then put something into the bowl. This object sort setup allows staff to go quickly. It allows them to increase their instructional pace, which I mentioned at the outset of this training. Object sorts generally indicate that a student needs a pretty dense schedule. Frequent reinforcement is going to be critical for these students. You want to make sure that during your sessions with these students, you're not just running object sorts, you're still doing that man training piece, because it is absolutely critical that students learn to ask for what they want. It is something that you can do is simply, after you've been working with the student, you provide a little reinforcement for their good performance, and then start offering them some things and prompting when necessary to teach them to ask for what they want. You can, and once again, I encourage you to watch some of the sessions on man training. It'll give you some really good methods that you can use to teach new mans, to practice old mans, to error correct if a student gets something wrong. But that idea of putting that into instruction, embedding that as a part of your teaching, is a very good idea. It's critical to do that, because that way students learn, I can ask from other people, I can ask from other staff, things of that nature. Interspersing those requests within the instructional setting will also maintain instructional control for you as the person teaching. Early learner programming should absolutely include teaching the students how to ask for what they want. This will often involve shaping of the response. It also, as an initial man's training program to teach the student how to request, it should include teaching for items that are present in front of the student, that they can see clearly that these are available. Excuse me, apologize. This will often involve making sure that as the student says their request clear, as they say, wah-wah, wah-ah, wah-ta, wah-ta, water, water, as they get to that water, they get better reinforcement for saying it in a more understandable fashion. But also now we can provide that extra reinforcement because they did better. Better responding gets better reinforcement is a general good practice. And that is at the heart of shaping a response from wah-wah to water, is that things get better the closer you get to water, to the adult form. As with all of the students, and I will highlight this again, the teaching students to ask for what they want is a critical step in self-advocacy. If you can't ask for help, if you can't ask somebody, where are my car keys, or anything of that nature, then you're going to have a tough time interacting in society. Man training is critical. It is a initial skill for self-advocacy. And if a student can't, or not that they can't, if they have not learned to ask for what they want yet, that should be a priority for instruction. Teaching the student to request these preferred items and embedding that into instruction will also reduce that motivation to escape, because when I'm sitting here working with my instructor, I sometimes get to ask for what I want, and I get it. I get what I want when I ask for it when I'm sitting with this guy, so that will reduce the motivation to escape that circumstance. As you're teaching early learners, you're going to take previously mastered skills and use them to prompt more complex behavior. Just as a small example, if there were two identical pens, one in front of you and one in front of me, and I said to you, show me tapping, but you couldn't do it. You didn't pick up the pen and tap it. Maybe you rolled with it. Maybe you just kept looking at me. But when I say, do this, the person taps. They pick it up and they imitate me. That mastered imitation skill can now be used to teach the skill of responding as a listener. In this case, I would say, show me tapping. And the student taps. I would then ask again, show me tapping. And if the student does it independently, I may provide some reinforcement at that point. If a student cannot imitate tapping, then it's very unlikely that when asked to tap, they're going to be able to do so. Additionally, in order to teach it, you want to use that motor imitation prompt because the student has to see what they're to do before they do it. Students initially will start, or early learners, excuse me, will initially start to learn imitation with object. Motor imitation without object has to be introduced at some point, but it should only be targeted when the student is generalizing these imitations that are in context, where there's an item in front of you and a context for doing it. You know, just think of the piano, the toy piano. The context is that it's a piano and it sort of lends itself to banging on the keys. Once you've taught a student perhaps push using the piano, you want to teach them push across lots of push using a keyboard, push using a smartphone. Any of those things should be done so that they're outside of the context that the student has maybe learned them, and the student is now learning them to some level, to generality. The limitations without objects, or excuse me, the imitation without objects that you should focus on first when you're able to move from motor imitation with object to motor imitation without object. The first imitations without object that you should focus upon are future requests or future labels. This can include, once again, augmentative sign language, for instance, as the modality while teaching students to engage in these skills. However, it is still important that a skills sequence is conducted. Initial actions that you're going to teach should be easy and move to complex, just like we talked about previously. This idea of start with the easy stuff so the student is successful and then build to complexity is critical. It's often easier, as an example, to imitate things where I can see my hand. So imitating something like this, where I'm tapping the table and I can see my hand rising and falling, that, for many students, will be easier than something like do this. And now I'm touching the back of my neck. You can't see what you're doing in this second example, so it may be a little bit more difficult. Remember, teach first things first. It's a critical consideration. Decisions on when to move to the more complex programs should absolutely be made by those people who are teaching the student, the team of people that are teaching the student. And it should be based on data and not on opinion or anything else. So when you move from when you move to more complex responding, it's going to be determined by your student. That they're going to tell you when they're ready or when they're not. You'll know they're not if there's more problematic behavior, if there's lots of errors cropping up, that kind of thing. In that vein, in the vein of starting easy, here are some types of imitations to consider. Rolling, tapping, and pushing objects. Controlling things, using a button or a dial. Specific action on specific item. What that means is that when I say do this and I tap my pen, that you have an identical pen by your desk that you're going to imitate with. When teaching students to imitate with objects, pardon me, you want to initially begin with just one object on the table and one object on the table in front of you. So you need two identical objects, one in front of the student, one in front of you. And you're going to run your imitation. Do this where you're rolling the pen. Do this where you're tapping the pen. Do this where you're clicking on the pen. Those motor actions initially will be with objects, but the student shouldn't have to select the object from a field. You want two identical objects, one for you, one for the student, and that's that. They don't need to discriminate it initially. Eventually, you do need to have the student select the correct item that they can imitate with. Just as you would need to be able to select tools that you need or software that you need at your job, you want to make sure that the student can eventually attend to a field of objects, identify the one that the instructor is using, pick it up, and then engage in the imitation. And finally, specific motor actions without objects. These are actions that we're teaching now. We were moving away from that object sort. This is a small list of things to consider regarding imitation and body movement, grounded versus ungrounded, and proximal distal versus cephalocaudal, student's view out of sight, all of those things. These things are excellent considerations when designing imitation programs for students with autism. There is, as I mentioned, the resource link on slide 75. I apologize, I can't go too far into this topic. Just know that teach first thing first is a principle across all students and across all verbal operants. We're going to move on now to the intermediate learner profile. Intermediate learners can often label some common objects, may even be able to also label some common actions. They might request some items that are present, that they can see, that they know are available, and maybe some missing items if something goes missing and they need to ask for it, they're able to do that. And they can generally follow single-step instructions. Things like, clap your hands, oh, go get your coat, and the student can go and retrieve their coat. But only single-step demands, or maybe one or two, unless there's a clear context. I always do this the same way every day. And we'll talk about that in a moment. Intermediate learners can often echo single words, maybe a few multiple phrases, but sometimes it's just single words. They can imitate single-step actions. So if you have an early learner, even though they may have a ton of mastered imitation, we're not going to move to more complex imitation until we're sure that that is generalized across people, places, time, etc. These students may also be able to fill in some questions, answer some questions, or fill in the blanks, but their responses may be rote as well. You don't know for sure until you do a check, that kind of thing. And one of the more important aspects of an intermediate learner profile is that they still require multiple trials of direct teaching in order to acquire the new skill. And that's an important consideration, because for the advanced learner, you're going to be looking for a learner that doesn't require multiple trials in order to maximize education. As I mentioned, your selection of targets should be sequential. You should learn to label many items across many examples so that you're moving in the right direction at the right pace. And your analysis is sort of a component of, well, what does he need in order to do this? Anytime you're selecting a target, you should be asking yourself, once he masters this, or once she masters this, what are they going to do with it? If we teach certain skills, what is the purpose of that skill? It's often to prompt a more complex skill down the line a bit. What I'm describing here is a skills sequence. First, you learn to do this. First you crawl, then you pull yourself up and sort of teeter-totter and fall down, but you keep doing that. And then eventually you pull yourself up and you might take a step. And it's a sequence of different things, of different forms of locomotion that eventually take you to walking. It's no different than, before you learn how to read, you need to know the alphabet, you need to know how to recombine letters into form words. Those are precursor behaviors and part of any coherent skill sequence. Intermediate learners will also need to be taught to demand or to request what they would like. Initially, this teaching will involve asking for items that are present, asking for actions. For instance, if a child likes to swing on a swing, they might ask for a push, or a student that likes to bounce on a trampoline might ask for jump while you help them jump a bit higher. As well as any activities if the student likes to play games or entertain themselves maybe with a brief video on YouTube. Those are all open options for manned or request or teaching the students to request what they would like. Your main goals in teaching this skill and teaching students to ask for what they want is to get a large number of items present, of actions, and of any activities the student might like to ask for. You have to make sure that what the student is asking for is something that they want. You have to essentially verify motivation, but you do want to, whenever possible, avoid using anything that might come to serve as sort of an inadvertent prompt. For instance, asking, what do you want, every time you are teaching a student to request, the student might learn not to ask when they have motivation for something, but rather when they hear the phrase, what do you want? There are times when it's, of course, acceptable to say, what do you want? You just want to make sure that that's not what is controlling the request. It's very rare that people ask you a sort of straightforward, what do you want type of thing. It does happen. Certainly at restaurants, a waiter or waitress will ask you, what would you like to eat? What would you like to drink? Things of that nature. But whenever possible, you want the demand or the request to occur mostly under control. I want it. There's a person here who can deliver whatever this activity or item is. So I ask them for that item, for that activity, for that action, whatever it may be. You want to look at building fluency so that a student can ask for what they want, but if circumstances change, they can quickly shift and ask for something different when required. This leads to things related to activities of daily living, employment skills, those types of things. The environment's always changing, and as the student's motivation shifts, so that you no longer want perhaps the scissors, but now the glue because you've cut out all the pieces and you're doing a craft activity, being able to then immediately shift and ask, oh, I need the glue now, is a critical skill. For intermediate learners, when they've learned to ask for items present, actions, things like that, when they've learned to ask for many, many of them, and they can generate those across people, across environments, things like that, you're going to be looking at teaching more complex requests, things like missing items. Within the intermediate learner program, you want to teach them to label common items and actions. So they should be able to label the things in their environment, stuff they interact with or that they come in contact with in their day-to-day life. However, please be cautious before moving to multiple component labels. As an example, if I were to ask you, say everything about what I'm doing with this pen, and the expected response being tapping pen, that is a skill that you can teach for sure, but you don't want to jump to that until they have many labels of actions, many labels of common items, and that sort of thing. This is basically building a base repertoire from which to build to complexity. Careful consideration should be paid to the idea of these component skills. If I don't know my prepositions, I shouldn't be engaging in mathematics instruction because so much of mathematics requires prepositions. If I don't have a repertoire of labeling common objects and common actions, then I'm going to struggle or perhaps be unable to engage in reading that involves comprehension. I might be able to read the words as sight words, but if I read "the quick brown fox jumped over the log," and I don't know quick as an adjective, brown as a color, fox as an animal that I can label, jump as labeling an action, over as a preposition, log as another item. If I can't label all of those things, what are the chances that in reading I'll be able to understand what I've read? They're very limited. We want to teach the basic repertoires and build to complexity. Many, many, many labels of common items. Many, many, many labels of actions. The true test, a good test for this type of programming is when a student can learn these things in 1 or 2 teaching trials. They don't require repeated practice, which intermediate learners often do. But as they build these skills and they begin to learn these things in a single teaching or 2 teaching trials, and when they can recombine these things. So I've taught the label of brushing, and I've taught the label of shoe, and I say, hey, what am I doing right now? They say brushing shoe. It's a weird thing to check, but it shows that they understand the concept of brushing, in that you could brush an object, even an object that's not something you would typically brush, and still say what is occurring. This is evidence that they're now taking these component skills and recombining them so that they're able to be more flexible responders in their natural environment. Echoic programming is often necessary for intermediate learners, and echoic targets should focus on pragmatic things that the student is going to say in the future. This might include future requests. So I haven't taught the student to ask for hot chocolate. They love hot chocolate, but I haven't taught them to ask for it yet. Practicing saying hot chocolate will be helpful if the student is accurate and fluent at saying those things when it comes time to teach them to ask for those things. More relevant would be future labels. So if a student hasn't learned to label a bike, they see a bike, but they can't say it's a bike, and we know that we're going to work on that skill soon, it is worth practicing saying bike so they're accurate and fluent and they respond immediately. You teach it, say bike, the student says it, good stuff happens, and so on. Ideally, you want to have collaboration with some professionals who have a skill set related to this kind of skill. Speech and language pathologists can tell you about sequencing of phrases, sequencing of articulation, what words are easier to say for students as a result of their physiology, their maturity, whatever it may be. The collaboration will help if you don't have that skill set. I don't personally have that skill set. I can't sit down and say, this word is easier to say than that word, so we should focus on this easier word first. That kind of collaboration is extremely valuable for educators. I do want to caution, don't begin teaching students to say multiple words simply for the sake of saying them, simply for the sake of an increase in what people will refer to as mean length of utterance. Teaching at this level, at the early level and at the intermediate level, should focus on function of language. I say milk, I get milk as a request. I say milk when I see a picture of milk as a label. I touch or select the picture of milk from a field when asked to do so. All of these things need to come under the analysis of the function. What are we expecting the consequence to be? If I say milk because I'm thirsty and I want some milk, and somebody says, oh, good saying milk, and gives me a cracker, that's not attending to the function. We always want to be looking at function of language, and the extra words, the using full phrases, those teaching procedures will come later. after a student can begin to recombine things in the example I gave earlier. You want to have that sort of novel recombinatorial repertoire for the student before you move into more complex, longer phrases, things of that nature. If you do have a student that cannot echo, and that you have not been able to shape the vocals, and if you're interested in any of the vocal shaping training, there are presentations by Barb Esch, Tamara Casper, and some of our consultants from Patton who have done presentations at the National Autism Conference. There are also, once again, to refer to the resource link, a number of documents on those teaching procedures on that resource link you'll see soon on slide 75. I encourage you to review those. If a student isn't understandable to a novel person, somebody who doesn't work with them every day, you may consider using augmentative communication such as sign language in order to give them an easily portable and easy to, or I shouldn't say easy, an easily portable and always available way to speak, to request, to label, to do all of those critical skills. The difference between teaching the sign versus the echoic is that you'll use imitation or you'll use physical prompts to teach the sign. If I were teaching a student to sign milk in order to ask for it, I might first teach the imitation, do this, and then use that imitation to prompt the request. Or if motivation's high enough, I may simply use a little physical prompt, gesture their hand up, push their, when they close, boom, you get the milk, and you learn to ask for milk using the sign for milk. As intermediate learners learn to label common items, it is important that you perform a check that they can then select those items from a field. So when a student has mastered labeling an item, let's say they've learned to label the notebook, and I show them the notebook, I say, what is it? They say notebook, wonderful. What you can do is the next day, put that notebook in a field with other items, whether it's the picture of a notebook or whether it's an actual notebook, whatever stimulus you're using, have that in a field and say, hey, where's the notebook? And see if they can point to it. A great way to sort of facilitate this type of skill is to have the student practice saying what they're getting. So if I'm teaching a student touch pen, I've got a pen in the field. As the student scans the field, I might say something like, and say it, or I can model for them. Watch how I do it. Pen, notebook. You try, touch pen, say it, and teach them to say out loud what they're selecting as they select it. The reason for this is that many students can learn to label something, and once they have a good number of these skills, they can label many things. Some students get the skill of selecting it from a field for free. Not all students, I want to be clear, this is not every student, and if a student does not learn to select from a field by learning the label of the item, it will be important to teach them to do that, because a big part of your life is just think of going to the grocery store. You walk through the grocery store selecting items from essentially a giant field. Same thing with the library. You go to the library. I take my daughter to the library and she wants the little critter book. She goes to the little critter book section. She has to find the one she wants and select it. Selection of stuff from a field is an important skill. Some kiddos get it for free, or some students, excuse me, not just kids, there's any human can get this for free, potentially by learning the label, but if they don't, you may need to teach it. You may need to teach the selection of stimuli directly. When you have to teach directly to select from a field, what you're going to be doing is using an imitation. You're going to indicate, give me the pen, and then indicate what the student is to select. The student selects it. You can move the field around, put the pen back in, ask them again without a prompt. They do it without a prompt. You may reinforce, you may run some other trials and check again. And on that second most independent trial, reinforce that response. But whatever decision needs to be made for the young man or young woman that you are working with, you want that decision to be based on the student's performance and the data that you are collecting on the acquisition of the skill. Intermediate learners may need instruction on imitating others. One way to assess this is to assess, does the student reasonably imitate a novel action? So they haven't learned to put their thumb on the back of their fist and wiggle their fingers. Now, for some students, that's going to be very difficult. They may not have the manual dexterity. And for those students, it may just be that they put the thumb on the back and they don't wiggle the fingers, or maybe they do it with it closed, or maybe they don't do it on their fists and they do it on the table. Whatever it is, you're once again thinking skills sequence, easy to complex. If a student cannot imitate novel actions, if they can't imitate what you're doing, period, you need to teach that using physical prompts that you carefully fade. Teaching imitation is a critical skill that all students need to be successful in life. That includes students if they're in a general education setting. If you can't imitate your peers, then when you're sort of not, maybe you weren't paying the best attention to the teacher. Lord knows I've been in that circumstance through my school career. And she says, get out your math book, turn to page 38. But I didn't hear any of that. I just noticed, oh, everybody's doing something. If I can look at my peer, see that they've retrieved their math book, and then sort of look over and see that they've turned to page 38, I can imitate that. I can follow to speak loosely, follow their lead type of thing. This is extremely important, especially as students get into more complex programmings. It's often the case that we observe others in order to know what to do under certain context. You want to target responses that are relevant for the student. You want to target stuff they're going to interact with. This is a time where the student's age is of significant concern. If I'm working with a young man or woman who never goes to the zoo, and they're 20 and about to transition out of formal schooling, I'm going to focus on ADLs. I'm going to focus on activities of daily living and items and actions and all of these things that I've discussed that are relevant to where they're going to go. I'm not going to focus on giraffe and rhinoceros and things like that. I want people to learn those things. I want people to leave with a full verbal repertoire. But there's a time for triage, and at a certain age, you have to start choosing very carefully what you're going to target. Is it related to something that they will actually interact with when they leave formal education settings? You want to use close in and far out examples. So I've been using the example of a pen and a notebook, this pen, this notebook. But to really have any evidence that a student knows what a pen and a notebook are, a pen or a notebook is, they need to be able to label or retrieve or talk about pretty much any pen or notebook that reasonably matches the criteria. You're at this point, you're looking at the idea of teaching the concept. So by lots of close in and far out examples, you can teach that discrimination, which we're going to talk about here in a moment. You're also going to check for generalization before moving to new programs. If the student only responds this way when Mr. Willow works with him, sitting across from him at a table with picture cards, then we've failed to teach a generalized repertoire. It needs, if I teach a kid to label 100 pictures of cars, but we go out to the parking lot and I point to my Nissan Versa and I say, what is that? And he says nothing or responds with a color or some other thing, then we haven't taught very well. We need to go back and look at our programming. What do we need to change? Because that kind of generalization is critical. As I mentioned with the early learners, and as I'll mention again with the advanced learners, the pace of acquisition will be different for each student. What you're looking for here is how quickly kids are learning, your students, excuse me, not kids, students, how quickly they are learning. Are they generalizing? And when I say learning, acquiring new skills. And, pardon me, are the responses both accurate and fluent? By sequencing your programs, by being precise in your decisions on when to move to new stuff versus when to teach a little bit longer, you can end up getting to a point of teaching much more complex verbal behavior by putting a lot of work in at the early and intermediate levels. If you try to jump up, if you try and just move in a sequential pattern too quickly, and you don't account for those precursor behaviors, you run the risk of teaching rote responding or responding that's under the wrong environmental control. We're now going to talk about advanced learners before we close out this session. The learner profile for an advanced learner is often that they will acquire skills fairly rapidly, such as learning to label an item in 1 or 2 teaching trials, learning to ask for new items, or even missing items once they've learned to label it. And they will generally, not always, but generally have a generalized imitation and echoic repertoire. They're able to imitate what you're doing or repeat what you've said pretty accurately, pretty quickly. Generalized is there in quotes because it's pretty rare to have a truly generalized echoic repertoire, imitative repertoire. I can imitate just about anything, but if you take me to a ballet and we watch Swan Lake, if I attempt to imitate a plie or any other move that a ballerina does, it'll be a very crude approximation. You wouldn't call it dancing. And that's simply because those ballerinas have learned a much different and a much more specific set of skills than I have. So that idea of generalized, you have to decide where your cutoff is for just how exact. We don't want to be too persnickety, but we also need to be persnickety enough that the behavior is going to be effective when the student is out in the natural environment. As an example, if I was teaching students to request and they're a signer, I might teach pizza, but in the sign language community, people will, just like people who speak, will sort of shorten stuff. They might say pizza like this real quick because there's a pizza there's a context. Those types of considerations are important. You want to make sure that you're teaching these skills in a way that when the student goes out into the real world, they'll be an effective speaker and an effective listener. For advanced learners, you do want to be cautious that they may have some splinter skills that it looks like they have complex verbal behavior, but when you scratch at the surface a little bit, you find that they may be rote responding. You do this through assessment. You want to assess the precursor behaviors. Even if the student is being successful in one aspect, maybe they're able to add and subtract, but you want to check those precursors because multiplication and division is just repeated addition and subtraction, but it gets very much more complex very quickly. And it's important that you teach all of the precursor skills necessary to engage in whatever the performance that your goal is. And once again, I use the example here because it's something I've run into personally, so it's salient to me, that students who know few prepositions are placed in a general education mathematics curriculum, and they're struggling and they're having problem behavior and they want to escape the class. They don't want to do any of this. Why is that? It's too hard. If I don't know over from under, and you're telling me put that over the ones place, but put that underneath the tens place, it's confusing. And of course the student is frustrated. Of course they don't want to sit there. Imagine if a third of this presentation was conducted in a language that you'd never heard before. You would be confused too. Teach the learner those precursor skills, fill in those gaps at the base, or ideally teach them earlier so the gaps are never there in the first place, so that students can be successful and use their previously learned behavior in order to do things like problem solve or learn more complex behavior. I've been talking a little bit about discrimination and generalization, and I just want to go over very quickly this concept. Discrimination is identifying things by their differences or responding to things by their differences. You see here a picture of 2 over-the-counter medications, and only one of them do you want to take before you get a good night's sleep, for obvious reasons. There are several discriminations you can make there. You could go by the color of the medication. One's blue, that's the one I'd take before I have to go to bed. The other's orange, and I definitely wouldn't take that before I go to bed. One says nighttime sleep aid, the other says gentle laxative. Once again, these are the aspects, but look how similar those 2 boxes are. If a student hasn't been taught to attend to all of the relevant stimuli, then discrimination is going to be very difficult because, once again, it's responding based on differences. Now, discrimination is always sort of, there's a little bit of a think of like a seesaw where it can go too much one way or too much the other way. Generalization is responding by similarity. I chose the picture there. I'm assuming nobody has seen a chair that is also an abacus, or that may just be a play, bead play toy thing. But it's a chair. And if you ask people who have learned the concept of chair, they'll tell you it's a chair because it shares those critical characteristics. 4 legs, a back to lean against, a seat to put your butt in. That's what those are some of the components of a chair that you want to consider. And even though my guess is that none of you in the audience have any familiarity or experience with this particular chair, is that you would call it a chair. You might say it's a weird chair. You might say, I wouldn't sit on that. That doesn't look very comfortable. But a chair is how you would respond to it. That's generalization. You've learned so many examples of other chairs, and you've learned the key components, the key elements of a chair, so that you can say, under a completely novel circumstance, that's a chair. That's the kind of responding we need to show generalization versus discrimination. If a student fails to discriminate, if I ask them, tell me where the pen is, and they can't say over the notebook, they say on the notebook, you have a problem of discrimination, and you need to teach both. Because if they say it's on the notebook when it was over the notebook, not only do they not know over as a preposition, they likely don't know on as a preposition as well as they may need to. So once again, discrimination is responding by the differences. Generalization is responding to the similarities of something. If a student makes an error of discrimination, you want to make clear discrimination error correction. In the example of over the book, but the student said on the book, I would then errorlessly teach over and on. I would do them right together, right next to each other, so the discrimination is clear. Over is anytime it's not touching the notebook, but the second that pen is on the notebook, it's on the notebook. Once it's touching, it's on. Anything from just a little bit above the pages to all the way up on the ceiling is over the notebook or above the notebook. Advanced programming often has some differences methodologically, but the principles that guide the instruction are the same. Errorless teaching paired with reinforcement, dense reinforcement for new skills, error correction procedures that people can follow, attending to motivation when teaching requesting. All of those things are still in play. You just need to now start considering, are they errors of discrimination? Have I taught enough that these are generalized skills and those types of things? The behavioral principles that guide good teaching are not different when a learner has the ability to engage in complex verbal behavior. The methodologies might change, but the principles that guide them are the same. Advanced learners will need things related to self-management and problem behavior, or self-management and problem solving in order to avoid setting up situations where the student might want to escape because they haven't learned to do that. This includes teaching students to engage in labeling behavior in their natural environment. How do you remember that you saw something? You likely said it to yourself at some point. This is the idea of being verbally present. And the keynote speaker, I believe I believe that she's closing the conference, Francesca Degli Espinosa. She talks extensively about the idea of teaching students to be verbally present at last year's National Autism Conference. I highly recommend any of her sessions. They're always excellent. But this idea that a student, in order to respond to their environment appropriately, has to also talk to themselves a bit about that environment, certainly about the most relevant things that are going on in that environment. It's also important at the advanced learner level that students have been taught to rehearse. If they have not been taught to rehearse at the intermediate level, normally this is a skill that's taught at the intermediate level. We talked a little bit about the idea of talking out loud as you select stimuli. You want to teach it now at the advanced, but just know it should be taught a little earlier than this. If it was not taught or the student didn't generalize it, that's something we can train for. I'm going to show you a video in a moment of that teaching procedure. This is the video, and what you're going to see here is a young lady who previously could not select multiple stimuli. What guides selection of multiple stimuli? What do you do when you forget your grocery list? You talk to yourself. Bread, eggs, milk, cheese, bread, eggs, milk, cheese, bread, eggs, milk, cheese. You get to the grocery store, you're rehearsing. Bread, eggs, milk, cheese. You get the bread, there's the bread. Now eggs, milk, cheese, eggs, and so on and so forth until you have everything that you were asked to retrieve from the grocery store. This is the very beginnings of teaching that skill. And it's a small example, but I wanted to show what this would look like because it's a little different than how people sometimes try to teach this skill, which is a critical skill for students to have, self-rehearsal that then guides some other overt behavior.
Sponge, the seal, and the cooler. Shampoo, sponge, seal, cooler.
Hey, we'll pick it up. We'll listen it up for you.
Sponge, seal, cooler. Shake.
Would you like to take would you like to sleep?
Very good.
Give me the shampoo, the sponge, the seal, and the cooler.
Schedule.
Good.
This one. Close your eyes.
Perfect.
Like that, Adrian?
So what you saw there was the student, I prompted the student to rehearse, to say the 4 items she was to retrieve, and then she retrieved them. She retrieved them in the order that I asked, which is very important. You have to teach the students to rehearse and then follow it in the order that it was requested, because this is a precursor skill to following multiple step directions in the natural environment. And if I make my coffee in the wrong order, if I pour the grounds into the bin, put the filter on top of it, close the door, turn it on, and then add the water, I haven't made coffee, I've made a mess because I did it in the wrong order. So it's critical that students can learn to self-rehearse and then follow that rehearsal in the order in which it was requested. This skill, once again, should only be taught when a student has many labels, they can request many things, they're able to follow single step directions in a generalized fashion. All of those component skills we talked about in the early learner and intermediate learner section need to have been taught to fluency and to accuracy before you ever start this more complex stuff. That's the first step to that student learning to speak and listen to herself so that she can guide her own behavior when asked to do more than one thing at a time. Advanced learners will often need to learn advanced mand or requesting skills. This might include removal of aversive. If somebody's butting ahead of you in line, you need to learn to request, excuse me, I was here, back of the line, something along those lines. You can teach this by setting up situations that are maybe a little bit aversive. You might show, tell a student they're allowed to watch their favorite movie, but you cover it up. You have your hand in the way of the iPad or whatever it is they're watching, and you can prompt them to say, move, get your hand out of the way, please, or something along those lines. This directly relates to self-advocacy. Removal of aversive is a critical skill, as is requesting information. Asking, who is that? How do I do this? What is that thing? All of those skills need to be arranged, need to be taught in an arrangement where the motivation is there for the information. Because when you ask for information, the thing that reinforces your request should be the information, not an M&M or a Skittle. When my daughter asks me, where are we going? I don't say, good asking, have a cookie. I tell her where we're going. That's what's of value at the time. Part of teaching students to be verbally present will eventually lead to ideas like perspective taking, what people will call perspective taking. This is essentially being able to say what another person is seeing or experiencing without obviously being that other person. That skill cannot be taught until the person can talk to themselves. I should say it should not be taught until they can talk to themselves and respond to their self-talk. This is why we should be teaching self-rehearsal for students at the intermediate level when appropriate. And finally, social skills. Social skills is directly linked to manned training. It is a significant portion of social interaction, involves asking people stuff and then responding to when they ask you stuff. It's like, think of any conversation you've had. Where'd you go this weekend? Nowhere, we're still in phase yellow, we got to stand. Oh, what'd you do? Well, we did watch a movie with the kids. What movie? All those are requests and then responses to the request. That's a conversation. If you can't ask for water when you're thirsty and it's in front of you, you're probably not going to be able to follow along with that kind of reciprocal interaction. I can't talk too extensively because I'm coming toward the end of my time about social skills training. Session 18 at this year's National Autism Conference will feature Kristen Hewitt and Heather Thompson. I had the honor and pleasure to be in Kristen Hewitt's room, and when she was a teacher before she came on as a consultant, saw her running these programs, these social skills programs, and it was wonderful. And that's a session, if you're interested in social skills, that's a session I would recommend you might want to check out. Students need, at the advanced level, need to learn to self-manage. This is related to ADLs. And once again, we're looking at that idea of, can you identify what you need to do? Can you talk to yourself? Can you talk yourself through what you need to do to accomplish that and then go do it? Can you talk yourself through a problem? This is also part of problem solving and other more complex skills. As with rule-governed behavior, how do you know the rule? If somebody tells you a rule, if you drive over 60, you're going to get a large fine. How do you know that rule? Well, first you have to hear the person, meaning you have to listen to the person, meaning that you have to say it to yourself a bit. I can't go over 60 in this area. If you can't speak to yourself so that you can control your own behavior, rule-governed behavior is going to be very difficult, perhaps impossible to teach. Rule-governed behavior, if you've taught rehearsal in the right way early, will come a lot easier for students and require much less direct teaching or direct exposure to the contingencies of the rules. Answering WH questions, this should be done around items that the student can already talk about, parts, features, the item itself, all of those precursor skills that we talked about in the previous two learner profiles. When those are filled in and the student can respond flexibly around the relevant aspects, then you can use those previously mastered skills to teach more complex responses to complex WH questions. Tell me something you write with, and the student is expected to say pen, but they need to know the action of writing to be able to label that. They need to know the point of the pen versus the clip and all of those things, because that's a full verbal repertoire that allows you to respond flexibly to those types of questions. As a brief aside, I do want to talk about students in gen ed settings who are advanced learners. If problem behavior is occurring in the general education setting, it is absolutely critical that, one, people are checking those precursor skills to ask themselves, is this escape maintain behavior because the general ed setting is a very different place than where the student was? And is this problem behavior related to the lack of some skill? If so, then we can we can teach that precursor skill so that they can be successful. You also need to look at appropriate manned behavior. This includes mands to peers, mands to other, to teachers who are not the special ed teacher that perhaps the student was working with before. Appropriate man behavior, excuse me, is critical because inappropriate man behavior in the gen ed setting will stand out and will be problematic for the student. If problem behavior is occurring in the general ed setting, you need to collaborate with the general education teachers and go over and form that task analysis around the skills that the student is being asked to use in that setting, and then check, have we taught that adequately? Has this student learned this to generalization? Can they discriminate between when it's okay to use a pen on a test versus you have to use the number 2 pencil? Might be dating myself there a little bit, I'm not sure. That idea of precursor skills being taught to fluency and accuracy before moving a student into a setting where it's going to be a lot of complex language use is critical. Finally, if students are in the gen ed setting, you should have data related to their participation, appropriate participation, and the students responding. And you should have some sort of criteria that you've developed for when you can fade having, say, a TSS or a para be with them. If a student can't independently work in the gen ed setting and the TSS is doing a lot of the work, why are they there? I'm not trying to be glib. That's a question that we need to ask. What are they doing differently as a result of being in this classroom or in this setting? Because as I mentioned at the very beginning of this, what is learning? What is the evidence that learning has occurred? The student does something different as a result of the teaching. That's what learning is. And if the student isn't doing something different, or they're doing something different, but it's not appropriate, it's problematic behavior or something, then we need to take a step back and analyze, how do we support this student so they're successful while also making sure that we're honoring their limited time in an education setting to maximize how much they learn, so that when they go out into the real world, they can be productive, independent members of society. Generally speaking, a focus on what the student does differently as the result of the time they spent in gen ed is something that you want to advocate and speak to, because that's going to make sure that whatever time they're out there, we can correlate that with data that shows, yeah, they've learned to do X, Y, or Z, or whatever the skills that they're learning out in gen ed. This is an article. I can identify Saturn, but I can't brush my teeth. It is an excellent article, and it is basically, it talks about the necessity and the importance of teaching skills that are going to be meaningful for students after they leave school. Obviously, meaningful is different for each student. What's meaningful for my daughter, for my oldest daughter, will be different than what's meaningful for my youngest daughter, even within a family. I put this in here as a recommendation for folks to read. If you'd like a copy and you can't find it online, I'll be happy to send it to you. It is available for free online. It's an article that really focuses on, are you teaching students the curriculum just to teach them the curriculum, or are you teaching them a set of skills that they're going to utilize in their day-to-day life? And that's a legitimate question. That's a question we can and should ask anytime we're talking about changes in placement, changes in focus, selecting targets for students, whatever it is. Focus on skills that will lead to independence is a good general consideration. I'm coming to the end of the presentation now, so I just want to do a very small review. When problem behavior is occurring, the interventions for that problem behavior, for when it occurs, must be based on the function of problem behavior, or functions. Problem behavior can have more than one function. The methods that address that problematic behavior should be spelled out explicitly in the behavior support plan following the assessment of function, so that anybody working with the student knows what to do to prevent problem behavior, what behavior they're trying to teach, and what behavior they're reinforcing as replacement, and what they should do if problem behavior occurs to make sure that they do not inadvertently reinforce the problematic behavior. These are the three critical components of any behavior intervention, and these three components must be in place for all identified functions of problematic behavior. Antecedents that reduce motivation to engage in problem behavior, teaching a competing skill, and making sure problem behavior does not contact reinforcement when it occurs. What you want to avoid are large shotgun approaches where it's just throw everything at the wall and see what sticks. Anything in the antecedent that's listed to reduce motivation to engage in problem behavior should be directly linked to whatever function the behavior has been assessed to be controlled under. Any consequence that follows the problematic behavior to prevent the behavior from contacting reinforcement must once again be related to the function. If I'm putting a kid in timeout because they engaged in problem behavior to escape a demand, well, I just reinforced it. I just gave them negative reinforcement, because in timeout, we don't often do our homework there. It's not how I've ever seen it run. Kids go to timeout when they engage in escape maintain behavior, and timeout may be an improvement if the instruction's is inappropriate. So make sure that these three components are in place for any problematic behavior per function. Each function needs to have all three identified and addressed with interventions. Interventions for problematic behavior must be evidence-based. Right now, the largest, most evidence-based interventions for students with autism is applied behavior analysis. And you can look at the National Autism Center standards reports, you can look at the main report on health, and then there are many others, large meta-analyses for this kind of thing. The intervention must be derived from the identified function or functions. It must be implemented across staff, and that means all staff have to be trained, and somebody has to make sure that they're coming in and checking that staff are doing what they're supposed to do. Because when you do something a couple times, you may start to drift a little. If you do it every day, weeks and weeks on end, it may be that you make some mistakes that you yourself don't recognize. Finally, whatever treatment, whatever intervention is in place should have data to show a decrease in the problematic behavior and an increase in the replacement or acceptable behavior whenever possible. These are 5 protocols to teach students that can be very helpful in addressing many of the common functions that we see. Ready hands is simply an incompatible behavior. You can't grab people, pull on clothes, grab hair, pull beards or earrings or anything if you're in ready hands. So this isn't a replacement behavior necessarily, but it's an incompatible behavior and a good one to teach. It's a very, very good, and these are all available on that resource link. The teaching procedures, data, collection sheets related to these are all available on that resource link that's about to be shown. And the NAC archives will also go over things like teaching a student to wait. How do you get a student to give up reinforcement? Generally, you use a little promise reinforcer. Here, let's trade. I'll give you this for some candy, and then you can have it right back. As well as teaching students to interrupt a preferred activity or transition from one place to the other, and teach students how to accept when they're told no, which nobody likes to hear, let's be honest. I worked in a lot of fast food places. I can tell you there are many adults who don't like to be told no when they're standing in line at Burger King. This idea of teaching these skills is important because it's going to lead to a more independent person in the world. This is the resource link where you can find all of the resources and many more that I didn't mention, but anything that I mentioned throughout this presentation, feel free to go here. You have to download it. As of right now, you have to download it onto a computer. I don't think that it can be downloaded onto a tablet yet, but feel free to go through there. If you have a question or concern or something that you're looking for that you can't find, you're free to email me. You'll have my email address in a moment. These are some sessions that are directly related to both instruction and problem behavior at this year's National Autism Conference. Session 5, which I already mentioned, is the introduction. That will go over some of the basic skill sets I had to discuss a little bit more rapidly than I'd prefer. Tim Vollmer is talking about impediments to effective behavior treatment. Amir Stapuglia's session on behavior management in the home and community setting we'll go over many of the behavior protocols I just talked about, such as accepting no, transitions, and things like that. Her sessions are always excellent. I highly recommend that, particularly for parents or staff working in homes with students or working in community settings with students. And finally, Dr. Bruce Tenor is going to be going over due process decisions, and that will be an excellent session going over some of the legal ramifications of appropriate instruction and how appropriate instruction, what its role is in preventing those legal outcomes, or those perhaps aversive legal outcomes for many folks. Finally, as a final review here, consider the role of practice. How often is the student engaged in the behavior that you want to see? Have you set up times for the student to practice these things throughout the day? Most of the students that we work with, a single time, even 4 or 5 times of doing something, may not be adequate for them to learn it to fluency. So you have to consider scheduling this type of instruction. School should be pretty dense as far as the schedule of instruction, but don't forget, if you embed a lot of reinforcement into that instruction, it's not that bad. It's a lot of fun to learn when good stuff happens as you're doing it. Teaching students requires staff are trained to teach them. If your paraeducators are working with students, if your TSS is working with students, if you as a teacher or as a caregiver are working with students and you're not sure how to teach something, that's training that you should look for. You can look at that. You can look for things like the patent website as well as others online. There are many sessions here at NAC that also cover these types of teaching procedures. And finally, have someone observe your teaching. Have somebody watch you teach with a fidelity checklist, which are on that resource link, and have them give you feedback. There's no way you're doing it 100% of the time correctly, any more than it's possible I'm doing it 100% of the time correctly. We all make mistakes. We all make small errors in our instruction, and it's okay because we can change our behavior, but only if we know about it. And that's why we need people to observe us and give us feedback. Instruction and education should be a very open environment. You should hope that you want people to come in and watch you work because of all the hard work and effort you're putting in to making sure your students learn those meaningful behaviors. In closing, these are the 4 aspects of good instruction I opened with. Be clear about what is taught. Be explicit in your teaching. Teach in a sequence. Teach the right things first, the first things first, and then move to complexity. All students don't advance through these programs at the same rate. That's an important consideration. And make sure that you and your staff have programmed the subject matter. You know how to teach, you know what to teach, and you know what to do when something goes wrong. Student makes an error. That's no big deal. I'll run that error correction procedure we've learned. That is 4 critical aspects for good instruction. And once again, this is not unique to students with autism. This is 4 broad recommendations related to just good teaching. This is what I'm going to close with. It's a quote from B.F. Skinner. And basically what he's saying here is you don't need to do things where you change your instructional content so that it's more in line with student interest, and it doesn't, you don't need to dress it up or do things. What you need to do is make instruction itself a set of improving conditions. Kids engage in all sorts of things. He talks about Pac-Man here, but my own kids are, they'd watch Roblox all day if they were given the opportunity. And what is reinforcing about Roblox, what is reinforcing about Pac-Man isn't different than what's reinforcing about education, in that it's well designed and you're successful. Good stuff happens when you do the right thing, and as a result, you want to do that more often in the future. I thank everyone for their time. I very much appreciate this. I wish I could have done this live and seen everybody. I hope you have a wonderful conference. I'm going to show my last slide, which features my email address. Please don't hesitate to email me if you have questions or concerns. Thank you very much.